It was a Tuesday that began like any other in Toledo, Ohio. Commuters hustled through intersections beneath overcast skies, cigarette smoke curling beside steaming cups of diner coffee on Bancroft Street. Early autumn carried the city in an uneasy calm, neighborhoods clinging to routine, the chorus of lawnmowers, distant barking, the familiar rumble of school buses rolling to their stops. But behind the repetition of these ordinary moments, an unresolved sadness lingered. For nearly 2 decades, the cold case that everyone whispered about in hushed tones refused to die. The unsolved murders of Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber. 2 names etched into memory. 2 faces framed in black and white photographs taped to the walls of a police precinct, waiting for an answer that never seemed to come. Jackie was a single mother and worked double shifts at Jefferson's Market on Monroe Street. She was the first in her family to finish high school. Melissa, her best friend since childhood, was the boisterous one, the organizer of impromptu block parties and surprise birthday cakes. On a late night in 2003, they vanished from their own street. One moment walking home from the tiny corner bar, the next erased as though the city had swallowed them whole. Their families searched. Flyers were stapled to power poles and crumpled inside rain-soaked mailboxes. The police launched press conferences. Rumors sparked, theories tangled like branches. Some pointed to an ex-boyfriend with a temper, others to a passing trucker whose route coincided suspiciously with the timeline. But evidence remained thin, hope thinner. Weeks melted into years, the story faded, but never gone, always there underneath, infecting the city's heartbeat with quiet ache. And then, on a chilled morning in October, everything changed. Local radio hosts interrupted their playlists. Televisions flickered with bold banners. Toledo cold case solved. Arrest stuns community. Outside the Lucas County Courthouse, reporters and windbreakers clustered around bewildered police spokespeople. In living rooms citywide, jaws dropped. No one could believe the news. Not just that it had happened, but who they arrested. Edward Eddie Clemens, owner of a quiet auto repair shop in West Toledo, a neighbor most knew only as the man who never missed a Sunday church service. Eddie's mugshot, wide-eyed and haggard, flashed across every screen. Phones rang off the hook. Who tipped the police? How did detectives crack a mystery that defeated so many for so long? Some wept in relief. Others recoiled in suspicion. The newspaper boy on Oakwood Avenue delivered a stack of headlines, each one blaring a question louder than the last. Was justice finally served? Or had the city just torn open scars that never fully closed? Inside police headquarters, Detective Mira Gonzalez, who inherited the file 5 years earlier, stared in stunned silence at the arrest warrant. She begun her career as a beat cop walking these same streets, haunted by the photographs of Jackie and Melissa, hopeful on prom night, laughing at a picnic. Myra's own resolve grew from watching their families demand answers year after year, refusing to let the case be resigned to a forgotten pile. Now, as she read the confession, fragments of regret, denials, half-murmured truths, she struggled to marry the image of Eddie the mechanic with the monster they'd hunted. In the houses bordering Jackman Road and Nebraska Avenue, front doors slowly swung open as neighbors stepped into the October chill, exchanging wary glances. Some recounted the day from years past when news vans first swarmed the neighborhood. Others remembered how quiet it became afterward, as if everyone collectively agreed to mourn in silence. Yet on this morning, there was no possibility of silence. The truth, whatever it was, would be forced into the daylight. Teenagers gathered in the park to speculate. Old-timers leaned heavy over diner counters. The bar on Sylvania Avenue filled before noon. For some, the arrest meant closure, a dull ache finally recognized, a chance to mourn correctly. For others, it unearthed old wounds and summoned new doubts. What else did they overlook? Was their neighbor, the man who offered them rides or fixed their brake lights, capable of such violence all along? Local reporters dug through the Clemens family history. Records surfaced. Eddie's wife, Lisa, collapsed at the sight of news vans outside her window. Their son, David, stood shell-shocked, refusing to contest his father's innocence or guilt. Police cruisers circled the block, their lights off, watching for any sign of retribution or vigilante outrage. In the center of the swirl, one detail haunted everyone. The crime was not the work of a stranger, but someone they passed every week at the hardware store. Detective Gonzalez let the case file fall open on her cluttered desk. Thick with years of failed leads and unanswered letters, it felt weightier than ever. She scrolled through the details of forensic breakthroughs long considered dead ends. An overlooked scrap of red fabric, DNA finally matched after nationwide database updates, statements from neighbors who'd moved away. Every lead reevaluated, every interview re-examined. The answer emerged in fragments, pieced together by new technology and relentless pressure. As the city collectively held its breath, the courthouse scene unfolded. Reporters jostled for the best angle, their microphones thrust through pulsing air. Gonzalez spoke simply, her tone unyielding. We never gave up. Family members clung to one another. Some sobbed. Others stoically maintained that justice would never replace what was lost. News of the arrest tore through Toledo's social fabric. Community leaders called for patience. Religious congregations organized prayer vigils. At the elementary school down the street, teachers struggled to explain what happened. The children, oblivious to the tides of grief, raced through puddles and drew chalk hearts on the sidewalks, a small and stubborn rebellion against the darkness. Meanwhile, at the edge of the city where the Maumee River winds through quiet industrial yards, a lone figure lingered on the pier. No one recognized him, but he watched the city as if waiting for the next chapter. For some, Eddie's arrest represented the triumph of persistence over despair. For others, it was a fresh reminder that every community harbors secrets, and that truth, once finally revealed, does not always bring peace. And so, as afternoon faded into evening and the city braced itself for the weeks to come, one thing became clear. The Toledo 2003 cold case was no longer history. It was alive again, raw, urgent, and demanding answers that would pull every resident, every family, into its unfolding shadow. The day Toledo stopped was only the beginning. When the city of Toledo was rocked by the news of Eddie Clemens' arrest, the shock cut deeper than headlines could ever capture. Word spread quickly, moving like a current through quiet neighborhoods and downtown diners alike. The man at the heart of the story, longtime auto mechanic, devoted churchgoer, and neighbor to many, was suddenly a suspect in Toledo's most infamous unsolved murders. People everywhere felt the foundation of their daily life tilt. It was as if the cold case that had haunted them for years had burst through the surface, demanding not just to be noticed, but to be reckoned with. For families of the victims, this day was always coming, yet nothing could prepare them for its arrival. Jackie Simpson's mother, Judy, remembered the winter her daughter went missing. Jackie, once a hopeful graduate, later a mother of two, fell into the grips of addiction but always clung fiercely to her family. She was last seen on a foggy night in early 2003, her laughter echoing through the block. Flyers went up. The search began. When Jackie's body was discovered under thorny bushes near a small tanning salon 3 months later, Judy was forced to transition from hope to mourning, knowing the pain the city now shared was the pain she'd carried all along. Webb, 21. Only a short time after, that same pain found Melissa Weber's family. Melissa, a young mother herself, had wandered between friends' apartments and long stretches of absence, addiction twisting her life off course. Her son, Nicholas, never gave up trying to reach her. The day Melissa's body was finally found, bundled in a purple comforter and hidden beneath an abandoned couch behind Matzinger Road, her family was swept into the same storm of grief, unable to comprehend how quickly a loved one could disappear and then be gone forever. Webb, 21. Public speculation fed on these tragedies for years. People theorized, pointed fingers, and quietly judged. The police, overwhelmed at times, struggled with limited evidence. The city's vulnerability was palpable. Those living on society's margins, addicts, sex workers, the homeless, were often ignored, and their disappearances rarely took center stage. And yet, for those who knew Jackie and Melissa, their lives were precious. For their families, there was no rest. Webb, 21. Inside police headquarters, Detective Mira Gonzalez worked the case with a burning sense of mission. She was meticulous, reviewing statements, revisiting DNA samples, thinking obsessively about the missed details. With new forensic technology, old evidence, fabrics, fingernail scrapings, the remnants of a comforter, revealed connections that once went unnoticed. The DNA matches, when they landed, felt less like triumph and more like a sobering reminder. Justice had moved too slowly. In the courtroom, the city's grief became public theater. Prosecutor Timothy Braun argued that Clemens was a predator, a serial killer cunning enough to vanish in plain sight. Facing the stoic jury, he traced connections between Clemens and both women, explaining how DNA evidence provided the link that investigators had waited years to confirm. Clemens' defense countered fiercely. They claimed the DNA's presence didn't prove guilt, nor could it reveal the entire truth of how it got there. This uncertainty lingered, infecting even those hungry for closure. But, ultimately, the family's testimony shifted the mood. Judy Simpson spoke of Jackie's commitment to her daughters and the nights spent searching for her. Nicholas Weber described a mother battling demons, but never absent in her love for him. Listening to their stories, the courtroom fell silent. The human cost of the case, the way it shattered and remade those closest to the lost, could not be denied. Beyond police tape and DNA reports, the city saw itself reflected in the pain. Eddie's arrest splintered assumptions. Longtime neighbors gathered in bars, discussing how someone so ordinary could be connected to so much darkness. Eddie's wife, Lisa, was besieged by reporters and barely able to speak as anger and confusion swirled around her family. The Clemens son struggled with the disconnect between the father he knew and the man portrayed by detectives. In these moments, it became clear that tragedy radiates outward, always snaring more than just its immediate victims. Morgan, a waitress at the local diner, heard customers speculating every night. Some thought the arrest brought relief, a sense, finally, that the city was safe again. Others were haunted by the realization that the lines between normalcy and secrecy were thinner than anyone had known. No one could agree on what justice meant. For some, it was the closing of a chapter. For others, it was the reopening of old wounds that might never heal. With the verdict looming, local leaders organized forums for concerned parents and support groups for survivors. Candlelight vigils lined the steps of Grace Church. Police presence increased in neighborhoods where trust felt fragile, their blue lights painting the dark streets in pulses of caution. Teachers comforted students whose homes had been shattered by news of the wasted years. Toledo's strength came into focus, not from the closure of a single trial, but from the way the community responded when finally forced to confront its own vulnerability. Detective Gonzalez stayed late into the night at her cluttered desk, reading over her notes. She saw herself in the mothers who wouldn't quit. When the jury retired to deliberate, there was no celebration, just exhaustion, and the hope that answers, however incomplete, could restore some sense of order. As the courthouse emptied, the city braced for the next day. Local journalists, tired but relentless, typed up the day's events. News vans poured their headlines into the ether. Verdict pending. Families gathered at home, grieving what could not be undone. At Matzinger Road, rain soaked the vines that once concealed Melissa's final resting place. In her own home, Jackie Simpson's mother placed a new bouquet under her daughter's photo, whispering her name like a prayer. The second chapter closed on a city still wounded, but moving forward. The darkness at its core made visible, but also finally confronted. The search for justice continued, and with it, Toledo's long reckoning with the human cost of secrets kept far too long. As the trial reached its tense climax, Toledo's anxious anticipation reached a fever pitch. Days blurred together under the fluorescent hum of the Lucas County Courthouse, where the fate of Eddie Clemens and much of the city's sense of justice hung in the balance. Outside, news vans crowded the curb, antennas piercing the gray sky, and neighbors swapped the latest reports with shaking hands over styrofoam cups of burnt coffee. In a city so changed by loss and rumor, every hour felt weighted with consequence. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with a kind of nervous energy that only accumulates after years of waiting. Prosecutor Timothy Braun worked tirelessly, assembling a narrative that cut through technicalities and humanized the suffering hidden in police reports. He argued that DNA found on both Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber was not coincidence, but evidence of predation and opportunity seized in darkness. Braun's words echoed, "This wasn't random. It was deliberate." It was a tragedy enabled by neglect and prolonged by a city's failure to protect its own. Clemens' defense team countered with a strategy rooted in doubt. They picked at every piece of the state's evidence, questioning the preservation of samples, the memory of witnesses, the possibility of contamination. DNA doesn't tell us when. DNA doesn't tell us how, declared Jack Viren, Clemens' lead attorney, pressing jurors to separate suspicion from certainty. For a moment, it almost seemed like enough. In cases with such high stakes, and so many years gone by, certainty is rarely found in black and white. But nothing could dilute the pain conveyed by the families. Each day in court, Judy Simpson sat in silent vigil for Jackie, a white flower pinned to her lapel. She described the night before her daughter disappeared, how Jackie hugged her children before leaving for work, promising to be home after a shift. Nicholas Weber, only in his late teens during his mother's final days, steeled himself to answer the prosecution's questions. His voice trembled, but he didn't look away, insisting that Melissa deserved to be seen for more than her struggles or the way her life ended. Testimony from forensic experts carried a cold, methodical authority. They described how advances in technology had resurrected old evidence, uncovering matches that would have been impossible years before. It's not perfect, one analyst admitted, but there's no other explanation. This is Clemens' DNA. The city's sense of relief, and also its remorse, flickered with every word. As closing arguments ended, the jury retired to deliberate. Tension twisted through Toledo's neighborhoods. Fathers watched their children more closely. Churches held quiet vigils, congregants whispering prayers for closure and peace. The streets felt different, old wounds open, yet something like collective resolve filling the space between strangers. Even for those with no direct ties to Jackie or Melissa, the verdict would say much about the possibility of justice in a city still healing from old betrayals. The wait was agonizing. Local reporters tweeted fragments of speculation. The city paused, silent and attentive. When the jury finally returned, the courthouse filled to capacity. Reporters set up makeshift studios on the sidewalks. Family members squeezed each other's hands, suspended between hope and dread. Will the defendant please rise? The voice of the judge was grave but unshaken. The verdict, guilty on all counts. For the murder of Jackie Simpson, for the murder of Melissa Weber, Eddie Clemens would serve life without parole. A collective exhalation swept through the courtroom, followed by tears, hugs, and the quiet pain of a community both vindicated and forever changed. After the conviction, the city's attention shifted from the drama of trial to the harder work of reckoning. Detective Mira Gonzalez walked outside the courthouse, reporters flooding toward her for statements. She spoke simply, "Justice, after so long, is always bittersweet. But we kept our promise." Toledo's police force received a rare standing ovation at the next city council meeting, and across neighborhoods, conversations changed notably. People grieved openly. Old hurts were acknowledged, and little by little, the first seeds of trust were replanted. Still, closure was complex. Families of the victims attended therapy sessions sponsored by victim advocacy groups. Some relatives struggled to feel the guilt would ever be enough to balance the scales of loss. Even among jurors, the relief of verdict was mingled with guilt. Was anything they could do really enough? Would this sentence bring peace to those who'd suffered alone for so long? The city's journalists went deep on the story, detailing the advances in forensic science that made the conviction possible, tracing the failures of past investigations, calling for reforms to prevent history from repeating. Local pastors gave sermons on resilience and forgiveness, and school counselors made room for students shaken by the swirl of media and adult anxieties. The story of Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber was no longer background chatter. It was now public record, a lesson and a warning. Neighborhoods west of Bancroft Street organized support networks, focused on helping addicts and the homeless, the same vulnerable populations so often ignored, whose danger once went unseen. Community groups lobbied for expanded funding to the police's cold case unit, insisting that this victory should set a new standard rather than be an exception. As the weeks passed, life resumed its routines. But the city wore its new vulnerability as both a scar and a badge, remembering that just beneath the surface, darkness can fester if left unchecked. Judy Simpson and Nicholas Weber, while never free of their losses, were seen frequently at City Hall meetings and community events, their stories shaping a new conversation about empathy, vigilance, and the cost of indifference. Detective Gonzalez, in late autumn, returned to her old case files, determined not to let another case go as cold as Jackie and Melissa's once had. As she glanced out her rain-streaked window, the courthouse bell rang in the distance, signaling both the end of one story and an urgent summons to confront those yet unresolved. The city of Toledo had its verdict, but healing, like justice, would demand more than a single sentence. It would take truth told in the open, day after day, neighbor to neighbor, until the shadows that once ruled the city's nights faded into memory. In the weeks after the verdict, Toledo was a city in quiet transformation. The trial may have ended with a declaration of guilt, but the process of reckoning had only begun. For many, the image of Eddie Clemens, the once unremarkable neighbor now infamous for a lifetime sentence, remained both a source of outrage and an uncomfortable reminder that evil could hide in plain sight. Residents watched as the boarded-up auto shop on Monroe Street stayed empty, a visual testament to the city's vulnerability and the price of not asking deeper questions in time. Jackie Simpson's mother, Judy, became an unexpected figure of resilience. The morning after the verdict, she stood on her porch accepting embraces from friends and neighbors alike. For Judy, closure was not so much an endpoint as an invitation to help others navigate their own grief. She led support groups in church basements, guiding parents through the raw confusion that lingers after the noise of the courtroom fades. She still placed fresh flowers beneath Jackie's photograph every Sunday, whispering her daughter's name, unwilling to let her memory fade as news cycles moved on. Melissa Weber's son, Nicholas, searched for meaning in an aftermath that felt both surreal and anticlimactic. Returning to his modest apartment, Nicholas found old letters and school photos, the reminders of a mother who'd struggled mightily to shield him from the worst. The trial had not brought her back, but it had brought strangers into his life, people who saw him less as a symbol of tragedy and more as a survivor. Nicholas enrolled in night classes, hopeful that learning could build bridges to a future untouched by the fate of his family's past. Detective Mira Gonzalez faced her own complicated mix of satisfaction and fatigue. In the precinct's cold case office, she stacked files with new determination, inspired by the rare sense of accomplishment that came from seeing a case through to its conclusion. But she did not celebrate. Instead, she pressed the department's leadership for increased resources, demanding that no other family wait so long for justice. Her efforts led to new funding for unsolved cases and more training for officers tasked with handling victims from vulnerable communities. Public reaction to Clemens's conviction was divided. Some saw the verdict as proof that Toledo could protect its own, even against a predator who lived undetected among them for years. Others were reminded of past shortcomings, the lost evidence, slow responses, and the tendency to overlook cases involving marginalized victims. Letters to the editor of The Blade called for oversight and reform, praising those who listened to the persistent pleas of Jackie and Melissa's families and urging the city not to forget its failures in the relief of resolution. Social services saw a surge in engagement. Outreach teams fanned across the city, making contact with those still living on the edge. Shelters worked overtime to provide a safe harbor for sex workers and people struggling with addiction, the same groups whose vulnerability had made them easy prey. Schools hosted assemblies on personal safety, and chaplains met crowds at midnight vigils in Memorial Park, blending prayer and practical guidance in equal measure. The psychological impact rippled outward. Some local therapists reported record numbers of new clients. The echo of the murders reignited old traumas for those who'd lost loved ones to violence or abandonment. In West Toledo, parents walked their kids to the corner store with a new wariness, and small business owners reviewed their security systems. The sense of community, fragile and fresh, demanded constant tending. Yet not all the outcomes were heavy. As weeks passed, a certain grit emerged, a pride in having faced down darkness through persistence, not denial. The mayor convened roundtables bringing together police, faith leaders, and advocacy groups, searching for ways to make sure Toledo became a model for other communities wrestling with unsolved violence. From these meetings sprang a new community task force focused squarely on cold cases and the well-being of at-risk women. The media's focus, once fixated on Eddie Clemens and the procedural twists of the trial, began to widen. Journalists profiled survivor advocates, followed up with detectives, and spotlighted the changes ushered in by the city's brush with tragedy. National outlets, at first captivated by the cold case solved headline, returned for longer pieces about the city's ongoing recovery. How justice, when finally served, only marked the start of deeper healing. One Sunday, as autumn leaves gathered along Broadway, a candlelit vigil illuminated Jackie and Melissa's names in flickering gold. Neighbors sang softly. A mural newly painted along a brick wall near Creekside Avenue showed two smiling women surrounded by the city's landmarks, the glass-roofed Botanical Garden, the high blue arch of the Anthony Wayne Bridge. Underneath, the inscription read, "Never forgotten. Together we heal." From the courthouse steps to the dimly lit living rooms where family photos still dominated the mantel, Toledo's residents found themselves changed, less naive, perhaps, but more bonded in their resolve. The cold case that had once defined their city no longer held uncontested power. In all the uncertainty, one thing remained clear. The questions these murders left behind would shape Toledo's approach to justice for decades. Answers would need to be sought in the cracks between the known and the ignored, in the margins where violence sometimes hides and waiting threatens to become a way of life. As she started a new file one late November evening, Detective Gonzalez looked out over rain-slick streets and made herself a promise. The hard work continues. Behind every cold file is a family who never gives up. In their city, hope and sorrow would always be neighbors, but no door would go unknocked, and no voice would be left unheard. In the months after the conviction, Toledo entered a long season of reflection and adaptation. For some, the city felt renewed, a place that had faced its worst truth and persisted. For others, the wounds lingered, slow to heal and impossible to hide. The name Eddie Clemens became shorthand for fear and the uncomfortable question of how well anyone could really know their neighbor. The community's response was far from uniform. On one hand, the city banded together, establishing scholarship funds in Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber's names to help vulnerable youth find opportunity outside the margins that had claimed their loved ones. On the other hand, familiar arguments reemerged, debates about policing, social responsibility, and the deep inequalities that helped perpetuate tragedy. Council meetings grew tense as old divisions were debated anew under the gaze of grieving families and determined activists. Local journalists launched in-depth series chronicling not only the investigation, but also the overlooked failures of prior years. Articles asked, how many missed signs led to this? How could social services and law enforcement work more closely to protect the city's most at risk? The retrospection was uncomfortable. Many longtime residents, especially those living in neighborhoods hardest hit by poverty and addiction, demanded that the city commit, in word and action, to never letting another case slip so cold for so long. At the same time, a slow shift in everyday life was underway. Households once wary of involvement became more active in local events. Block parties, town halls, fundraisers for victim support groups, and public safety seminars filled the community calendar. Churches doubled down on their aid programs, expanding meal services, and offering free counseling to those quietly struggling. A Light Up Toledo initiative, Started by a group of young teachers and business owners, strung lanterns along the main thoroughfares after sunset, a symbolic and practical step toward making public spaces safer, more inviting, and always watched. Nicholas Weber, now a young adult, found himself an unlikely advocate. At first, his grief kept him silent, but as more families approached him for guidance, he realized his story had the power to shape change. He spoke at schools and forums, challenging audiences to see victims as loved ones, not just headlines. His testimony prompted funding for a youth mentorship program, helping teens with unstable home lives connect to positive adult role models before they ever risked falling through society's cracks. Detective Mira Gonzalez, buoyed by the momentum of a city determined not to forget, took on the expanded role of Cold Case Unit Coordinator. She led training sessions around Ohio, urging other departments to integrate new forensic techniques early and to listen with greater empathy to those whose lives most often went unheard. She testified before state lawmakers, helping channel funds from Clemens's prosecution into advanced DNA testing programs that have since aided in solving cases beyond Toledo's borders. Still, not every outcome was a neat victory. For many, the trial left a residue of suspicion and anxiety. Some residents found themselves struggling with sleep, caught up in cycles of guilt for not having noticed Eddie's double life, and worried that other dangers might still lurk unrecognized. Service calls to the city's mental health hotline rose sharply, and emergency shelters regularly hit capacity, strained by new waves of people seeking help. Judy Simpson, while celebrated as a voice for victims, sometimes retreated from the public eye, exhausted by the demands of leadership without her daughter. On days when memory was too raw, she allowed herself to grieve privately, keeping little rituals alive, lighting a candle, telling Jackie's stories to her grandchildren, and tending the community garden she'd helped start in memory of Melissa and Jackie. It wasn't triumph, but it was endurance, small acts against forgetting. Toledo's police, no longer content to operate in isolation, formed a joint task force with neighboring Lucas County agencies. Their goal: track any patterns of violence against women and marginalized groups, share resources, and keep pressure on unsolved cases that might otherwise languish. Quarterly newsletters updated the public on progress, and for the first time in years, citizens were encouraged to submit tips anonymously through a new online portal, breaking down old barriers between law enforcement and the people they served. Media coverage shifted from the lurid to the constructive. Whereas the trial's early days were thick with sensationalism, later stories highlighted survivors' advocacy, the successes of new prevention programs, and the tireless search for missing persons too often overlooked. National organizers took note. Other cities began sending delegations to study Toledo's approach, eager to replicate its blend of remembrance, accountability, and hope. Still, the currents of mistrust could not be swept aside overnight. For some, the pain of the past manifested as anger. Old rivalries sometimes resurfaced at city council meetings or in the comment sections of local news sites. But even these divisions felt active, a sign that people cared enough to stay engaged and insist on a better future. Community leaders made room for dissent, understanding that the messy work of healing was as integral as any system or policy. By the first anniversary of Clemens's conviction, Toledo marked the date with a night-long vigil downtown. The city square, usually quiet at dusk, was alight with candles, each flicker a pledge to remember and rebuild, not in the shadow of violence, but with the active light of accountability. Judy, Nicholas, and Detective Gonzalez spoke, joined by those who'd known Jackie, Melissa, and other lost voices. There were tears, laughter, and even hope as the community looked toward the next chapter. Thus, the city continued its dance between memory and action, never able to restore all that was lost, but committed to protecting what still could be saved. In the bonds of shared pain and stubborn hope, Toledo found the beginnings of its new identity, one built less on the tragedies of the past and more on the bridges it had begun, at last, to build toward a safer and more compassionate future. A year after the city's most notorious cold case finally brought justice, Toledo found itself standing at a crossroads, determined, at last, to be more than a city defined by its shadows. The aftermath of the Clemens conviction did not fade into silence or complacency. Instead, it gave rise to a movement, a citywide reckoning with what safety and justice truly mean, and a reimagining of how to transform pain into prevention. Numbers told one story. From January through June 2025, Toledo recorded a 21% drop in homicides, a 24% reduction in robberies, and nearly 29% fewer people shot than in the previous year. Theft, burglaries, even auto thefts, all declined sharply. The mayor's press conferences became occasions of cautious optimism, not apology. City officials, police, and community advocates joined together in front of local news cameras, repeating the new message. Toledo was changing, and this time, no corner or conversation would be left behind. Even when it doesn't feel like it, we are still moving forward, Mayor Wade Kapsukiewicz told the press. The weight of the past never far from his words, Webb 36, Webb 40. These outcomes weren't accidental. They sprang from a patchwork of initiatives grown directly out of community heartbreak and self-examination. At the front line was the ambitious Peace in Motion plan. More than 40 targeted interventions, ranging from an unprecedented expansion of summer and after-school youth programs to trauma recovery services, blight removal, employment, and mentorship projects. Webb 40, Webb 42, Webb 44. Over 70 youth activities now blossomed in parks and rec centers. Sports, academics, art, and even podcasting workshops gave the city's children new ground to claim. A future far from the street corners and abandoned lots where violence once thrived. In the gleaming, newly restored Wayman Palmer YMCA, teens learned to code, organize debate teams, and dance. Mentorship became a calling. Both Judy Simpson and Nicholas Weber were regular speakers in school auditoriums. Their stories, once private wounds, transformed into communal pledges. "We're building something Jackie and Melissa never had," Judy would say, her voice both fierce and gentle. Nicholas, older now, echoed the call for vigilance and empathy, urging every listener to notice the unseen, to offer help before tragedy could take root. Webb 40. Yet the work stretched beyond children's programs. Much of Toledo's violence, city leaders recognized, fed on despair bred by poverty, dilapidated housing, vacant properties, streets choked with debris. Knowing this, the city poured millions into infrastructure, demolishing over 300 unsafe empty structures, cleaning up more than 1 million pounds of neighborhood waste, and building more than 230 affordable new homes. For families at the edge, 35 became homeowners for the first time. Small but vital victories in neighborhoods where hope had once seemed foolish. Webb 40, Webb 42. Environmental design also became a public safety weapon. Lighting projects banished the darkness of alleys and parks. Urban planners and volunteers planted trees and sculpted paths with clear sight lines, making places once avoided now inviting and secure. New cameras and emergency call boxes dotted high-risk areas, adding another layer of deterrence and reassurance. Crime prevention through environmental design was no longer a bureaucratic phrase, but a philosophy guiding every municipal project. From playgrounds to bus stops, from crosswalks to subways. Webb 41. But perhaps more than anywhere, hope rebuilt itself in Toledo schools. Counselors and teachers, newly trained in trauma-informed practices, worked hand in hand with school resource officers, no longer just security guards, but mentors skilled in de-escalation and compassion. Classroom lessons devoted time to social-emotional learning, while after-school workshops addressed everything from conflict resolution to financial literacy. At the same time, the city's famed Police Athletic League invited hundreds of youth into structured programs where athletic discipline and team spirit became bridges out of isolation. Detective Mira Gonzalez herself mentored a cohort of teenage girls, using her own career as evidence that justice and care need not exist apart. Webb 41, Webb 44. The technological revolution that powered these changes was swift. New funding, partially fueled by grants tied to solving the cold case, outfitted the Toledo Police Department with advanced digital forensics labs, anti-trafficking technology, and faster communication systems. Data analytics allowed law enforcement and social workers to spot emerging risks and deploy help before violence could spiral. Partnerships with Bowling Green State University's researchers placed Toledo at the forefront of national violence prevention strategies. Its programs soon the envy and study topic of other cities desperate for similar progress. Web 40. To keep momentum and trust alive, officials emphasize transparency. Malcolm Cunningham, director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, released quarterly reports, held public forums, and invited feedback from some of the city's loudest skeptics. Residents were able to submit anonymous tips to police, request safety checks on their blocks, and, perhaps most poignant, nominate struggling families for direct support from the Healing and Compassion Fund, a microgrant program inspired by the very losses the city sought to prevent. Media coverage adapted, too. Whereas reporters once dwelled on lurid crime details or left families feeling exposed, the new stories focused on community heroes, the resurgence of block parties, and the hard, slow work of rebuilding lost trust. Judy and Nicholas became the subject of an award-winning documentary about Toledo's journey, from heartbreak to incremental healing, offering a window into grief and activism, and the small victories that form the backbone of progress. Old wounds, however, did not fade easily. Some neighborhoods, still traumatized by years of neglect, struggled with suspicion, skeptical that any city-led effort could undo decades of hardship. Parents, while grateful for more resources, remained vigilant, keeping children close and doors locked at night. Older residents remembered other fallen friends whose cases remained unsolved, their pain a poignant reminder that safety, like justice, must be continually pursued. On the anniversary of Clemens's conviction, a new mural graced the wall near Jackie and Melissa's old neighborhood. Two women's faces lit by golden sunrise, surrounded by symbols of Toledo's renewal, open doors, strong hands, a city skyline under gentle clouds. The mural was not just memorial, it was promise and proof. During a citywide vigil, hundreds gathered in candlelight, their voices blending into songs of hope, their tears falling with gratitude and grief alike. Toledo's mayor and police chief repeated the same message. Perfection is impossible, but progress is inevitable so long as compassion and vigilance remain at the forefront. When you look at what this city has accomplished in a year after decades of heartbreak, Chief Michael Trondle told the crowd, it's proof that even the most wounded places can heal, so long as nobody faces their pain alone. Web 40. For Detective Gonzalez, closure took on a wider meaning. Each reopened file reminded her of unclaimed potential in every unsolved case, but also of the difference made by persistence and heart. She visited schools, trained other detectives, and volunteered on weekends with neighborhood watch teams. Hope for her was not grand or dramatic. It was built from daily choices to show up, to listen, to believe that every voice and every life mattered. Community leaders knew setbacks would come, occasional surges in crime, policy debates, tragedies that defied prevention. Yet the city's new muscle for collective action, built painstakingly through the shadow of its old wounds, offered reassurance. In City Hall, on stoops, and at barbecues after Little League games, people found themselves sharing not just the pain of loss, but the pride in what had come from it. As summer gave way to fall, and another school year brought both uncertainty and anticipation, Toledo's new identity began to crystallize. No longer the city where a cold case defined a generation, it was now a place where stories of survival, recovery, and unlikely courage were intertwined with the everyday fabric of life. The new Toledo might never be free of sorrow, but it refused to let sorrow define it. In every corner, one message lingered. As long as each person mattered, there would always be hope. By the third summer after the trial, Toledo had learned to measure progress not merely in numbers, but in lived experience. What began as a community's desperate response to the trauma of losing Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber had grown into a full-fledged movement, altering the city's social, political, and even architectural landscape. The transformation was sometimes invisible, a subtle shift in attitude, a quiet gesture between neighbors, but also fierce and apparent in the way Toledo prioritized safety, empathy, and hope. The numbers continued to impress, a tangible marker of change. According to city reports, Major violent crime rates dropped across the board during the first half of 2025. Homicides were down 21%. Robberies, 24%. The number of people shot fell nearly 29%. Even thefts from motor vehicles, burglaries, and auto thefts saw declines, proving that the city's multifaceted approach to violence prevention was doing more than just shifting the spotlight from one problem to another. Toledo was, by nearly every measure, getting safer. Web 36, Web 40, Web 43, Web 44, Web 45. But behind those statistics were stories of families healed, but also of ongoing struggles. Judy Simpson spent much of her time counseling others. Her living room transformed into an informal support center for parents who feared their children might become casualties of the next tragedy. She sat peacefully among donated quilts and family photos, leading group conversations about grief, forgiveness, vigilance, and the means of rebuilding a life after loss. For Judy, the journey was not linear. There were setbacks, days when hope felt thin. But she refused to let her daughter's memory be reduced to crime scene statistics. Nicholas Weber, meanwhile, grew into an effective advocate for youth. He founded Next Steps, a mentorship organization focused on skill building, conflict resolution, and emotional resilience for at-risk teenagers. The group quickly became a staple in schools and community centers, employing social workers, peer mentors, and volunteers. Nicholas believed the answer to violence rested in catching problems early, offering help before wounds became irreparable. At City Hall, new energy consumed local government. Mayor Wade Kapsukiewicz often cited the cold cases resolution as the impetus for many reforms. More officers added to the police force, fewer officers confined to desks, and a marked increase in walking beats, where police built neighborhood relationships. Community policing became the expectation, not the exception. Officers underwent quarterly training in de-escalation tactics, trauma-informed interviewing, and implicit bias awareness. Concerns about police violence, constantly in the national discourse, were met with guarded optimism. Toledo's leadership was determined not to repeat mistakes from other cities. Web 44. Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. The new office founded during this period trained dozens of frontline workers in Rewire CBT and other behavioral interventions for youth, connected survivors to resources, and responded rapidly to newly reported violence. Montz created a violence review committee, built bridges between city agencies and grassroots organizations, and launched a $2 million community-based violence intervention grant, one that provided microfunding for local efforts and put neighborhoods themselves at the center of reform. Web 40. Vigilance also took physical form. Over $28 million in park upgrades since 2018, culminating in a new Wayman Palmer YMCA, transformed Toledo's physical landscape. Blight removal was part and parcel of safety. More than 300 vacant structures were demolished, replaced by homes for families previously adrift in poverty and insecurity. Clean, well-lit streets, safe housing, and accessible recreation were the visible legacy of a city that committed block by block to making its physical spaces reflect its best aspirations. Web 40, Web 42. But none of these successes erased the tougher realities beneath. Trauma takes time to heal, and the shadow of unsolved cases remained in the conversations of older residents and the stories whispered at kitchen tables. Vigils continued. Annual rituals on the anniversary of the girls' deaths or the trial's conclusion, both to remember and to remind. Mural artists painted Jackie and Melissa's likenesses on prominent walls, their faces surrounded by symbols of resilience: open doors, sturdy hands, the skyline under rising sun. Public forums retained their edge. Citizens still pressed for answers about cold cases, questioned whether reform went far enough, and demanded that marginalized communities not be left behind. Activists pointed to the fact that even after 3 years, some neighborhoods still saw higher rates of violence. They advocated for economic investment, education reform, and the empowerment of those at risk. Detective Mira Gonzalez, now leading multiple cold case units across Ohio, was a fixture in public discussions, balancing hope with realism. She understood that success required humility, an openness to criticism, a willingness to keep listening, and a commitment never to declare the work done prematurely. Mira spearheaded partnerships with universities, shared best practices at conferences, and sometimes just sat quietly with survivors, listening rather than talking. Through her, the lesson was clear. Vigilance did not mean paranoia, but conscious, collective responsibility. In schools, Principal Tyrone Beck welcomed new counselors, support staff, peer mentorship programs, all with the backing of a city government finally willing to fund prevention over punishment. Teenagers produced podcasts, music, and art centered on themes of safety, courage, and remembrance. One student, Marissa Thomas, wrote an award-winning essay titled After the Shadows. Her closing lines echoed community sentiment. We do not erase fear by forgetting the past. We embrace hope by naming it, and by promising ourselves not to turn away. The business community also joined the transformation. Employers advertised job training for survivors and returned citizens. Banks offered microloans for young entrepreneurs from at-risk backgrounds. Local media generated daily reports tracking gains and setbacks in neighborhood safety. But resilience came in quieter moments, too. At dawn on July 5th, Judy stood beside her garden plot, letting the sunrise remind her of possibility. She found herself marking the dates not only of tragedy, but of each small triumph: a child who succeeded in school, a neighbor who returned after years away, city council's vote for a new violence prevention program. In each act, she saw the collective will of a city refusing to let its story be only about loss. For the survivors and families left behind, healing was imperfect and ongoing. It lived in therapy offices, at potlucks, during church service, and in the voices of strangers who learned, gradually, to trust if not forget. The ripple effect touched each facet of Toledo life: parks, schools, businesses, policing, the city's self-image. As the third year passed since the cold case broke, the city celebrated and mourned both at once, marching forward with determination, but never losing sight of what sacrifice had built their strength. A simple mural near the courthouse captured it best. Two women lifted by a web of hands, sunlight falling over a road that wound into open horizon. The message inscribed beneath: strength in vigilance, hope in action, memory endures. With every step, Toledo redrew the boundaries between past and future, not as a city without crime or sorrow, but as a city full of ordinary heroes, hard lessons, and a faith in its power to change. And in each corner of the city, from playground to precinct, neighborhood to city hall, that faith is tested and renewed, day after day, by those who choose to care, to act, and above all, to remember. As the summer of 2026 dawned, Toledo stood at a threshold, its journey through tragedy and transformation culminating in genuine change. For years, the city had fought to shake free from headlines about unsolved murders and violence, its spirit tested by the long shadow cast by the cold case of Jackie Simpson and Melissa Weber. But by now, the story was no longer one of loss alone. It was about the slow, painstaking revival of hope, community, and safety. Signs of progress were everywhere. Data from the city and independent organizations painted a clear picture. From January to July 2025, homicides had declined by 21%, robberies by 24%, and the number of people shot had plunged almost 29% compared to the prior year. Other crimes, like burglary and auto theft, also saw meaningful reductions. More telling than numbers was the fact that, for the third straight year, Toledo's murder rate fell, reaching its lowest level since the pandemic-induced surge of violence in 2021. This trend was part of a wider movement across Ohio and the nation, but Toledo's turnaround was especially pronounced. Web 36, Web 44, Web 46, Web 42, Web 43, Web 45. The roots of this change were diverse and interconnected. The city's approach, spearheaded by Mayor Wade Kapsukiewicz, involved a blend of a little bit of everything. Since taking office in 2018, he had overseen the growth of the police force by 50 officers, reversing decades of steady decline. Community policing is not the only answer, but is a necessary part of any solution, the mayor told the press, his focus sharpened by collective sorrow and hard-won optimism. Web 44. Training played a critical role. Annual instruction in de-escalation tactics and trauma-informed policing was now standard for every officer. While police violence remained a public concern, Toledo's department pushed to become the most prepared and responsive of any force in Ohio. The ripple effect was felt in increased accountability, fewer violent encounters, and a spirit of partnership that extended beyond law enforcement to neighborhood watch groups, social workers, and teachers. But police work alone could not solve every problem. The city's greatest innovations sprang from collaboration and empowerment. Summer youth programming grew explosively. Cooking classes, coding camps, and podcasting groups offered thousands of kids healthy alternatives to risky behavior and empty streets. The Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement (MONS) multiplied its presence, training violence interrupters to spot conflicts before they grew lethal and to offer support before hurt hardened into hatred web. 44.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.